Hi, I'm Leslie Chapman-Henderson, President and CEO of FLASH, the nonprofit Federal Alliance for Safe Homes. I will be your host today for our podcast, Strong Homes, Safe Families, where we help you prepare for disasters of all kinds. During our show, we will share information, tips, and interviews so you can protect your family and your home before Mother Nature heads your way. Today, we're talking about getting prepared for hurricane season, and we are delighted to welcome our first guest on our podcast and our first guest before hurricane season, Ken Graham. Ken is the director of the National Hurricane Center in Miami, as well as a longtime friend and leadership voice for the disaster safety movement. Welcome, Ken.
Hey, Leslie, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for kicking off our podcast series in such a strong way. So, Ken, all of my friends in the weather space always tell me that they first thought about a career as a meteorologist at a very early age. So I have to ask you, when did you know that you wanted to be a meteorologist? How old were you and how did it happen?
Wow, I love that question. That's a great way to start. I mean, I was 7 years old when I knew I wanted to do this and be a meteorologist. And people ask me, in classes at a young age, we learn about the planets and everybody had their favorite planet. I think I was the only one that always said Earth. Earth is my favorite planet. I love the Earth. And it was at a young age, it was being evacuated from our home because of rising water. And everybody's like, how'd you get into hurricanes and growing up in Arizona? And I said, well, we were evacuated several different times. And I went to my encyclopedias to figure out why we were evacuated. And it was tropical moisture. It was tropical moisture from old tropical systems that put too much rain on the ground and evacuated us. So I was taking observations on my calendar. My mom told me for years and years, I would take a daily observation and write it on my calendar. I knew I wanted to be a meteorologist. I wanted to do this since I was 7 years old.
That is an amazing story, especially that you were thinking about the tropics from Arizona. And I think that's almost pretty instructive as we talk about disaster resilience and how people can come back from a hurricane and bounce back quickly, and how many different things that it takes that have to go the right way in order for people to come back and recover. We know we can't prevent the hurricane, of course, but we can do our best to come back as swiftly as possible. So when we talk about that, we try to break it down because it takes a lot of different things to go well. And we always like to talk, as you know, about science, public policy, and then the practice, the things that we do. So I thought what we would do today is talk about it that way as well, because I think that your perspective on all three of those is really, really helpful to everybody out there that's trying to get ready. So let's start with science. And what I'd like to talk to you about first is tell me about the things that are happening on the scientific and research front at the National Hurricane Center. And what are you most excited and proud of that's underway there?
I think one of the things is looking where we've been. I mean, what a scientific breakthrough in the field of meteorology to think about how far we've come with the track forecast. If you think about, I was comparing, you look at Hurricane Floyd, you look versus Dorian, and in a period of 20 years, where, you have these large errors in the forecast with Floyd, and how we've been able to narrow that down with Dorian in just 20 years. I mean, just in those two comparisons there, where, one of the largest evacuations in U.S. history at the time for Floyd, where everybody from Florida to the Carolinas evacuated. But in Dorian, it didn't happen that way. And that's because the track forecast has just been such a scientific breakthrough. I think I get excited about that. It's about how we've been able to improve the forecast. And by the way, it's not just about the improvement of the actual track. The better we can do with the track, we can do better with the impacts. We can do better with how much rain we're going to get. We can do better with how much storm surge, which is the number one killer that we're going to get. We can get better with all those impact forecasts, the better we are with the track. And I get excited all the time how we're coupling the social science with the physical science, because it takes both to really get the job done.
That's outstanding. So the forecast track, and then we tackle, and continue to tackle impacts and things like storm surge. So are those the kinds of things that you guys are focusing on right now on the research front?
Yeah, the research front, we continue to get better with all those forecasts. The storm surge, expanding that to include waves. We're actually looking at making sure that we include waves in that forecast, which hasn't happened in the past. So that's another big breakthrough as well. But I think some of the research, we have to look at some of the places where we still have to grow. Leslie, we still struggle with the intensity forecast. It's a very difficult forecast for the models, difficult forecast for us. We still have these situations that these rapid intensification storms just really quickly. And I think that's a big part of the research. What is that? Is it atmospheric? Is it the ocean? There's a huge amount of research going into looking at the oceans. You think about it. We've already heard it this season, right? Oh, the temperature of the oceans are so warm. But what's interesting to a hurricane is what's the profile of that temperature. Those sensors are right at the surface. What's going on 100 feet below the surface? How about 500-600 feet? Are we turning up warm water or cold water? That's the kind of stuff that there's some research dropping sensors into the ocean, looking at that profile of the atmosphere. Think about that. If we could figure out what's exactly going on in the oceans and also the atmosphere and couple the two, we might be able to have the next scientific breakthrough and really try to figure out some of this intensity forecasting, which is very difficult.
So when you talk about the challenge of intensity forecast, what are some of the hurricanes that come to mind? Is Michael one of those?
Michael's definitely one of them. Listen to this stat, Leslie. It's really interesting. I was jotting some things down. I did a presentation yesterday and talked about this. We always hear this, this category 5. We really try to talk less about category and more about impacts. But if you take about the category 5 landfalls in the continental United States, there's only been 4, not a frequent event. But here's the stat that's interesting. If you look at it, the 1935 hurricane, you look at Hurricane Camille, 1969, Andrew, 1992, and Michael are the 4 that come to mind in the continental United States. Do you know 4 of those were tropical storms just 3 days prior? Every one of those has been a rapid intensification situation. So that's, what's going on there? What causes a storm to rapidly intensify or not? We've seen other ones not behave that way. There's still some things we don't understand. There's still uncertainty always in that intensity forecast.
So say those 4 storms again.
Yeah, think about it. I mean, the 1935 hurricane that impacted Florida, Camille, that hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast in 1969, which we just commemorated the anniversary. Went over there last year to commemorate that anniversary. Andrew, 1992, impacting Florida and then going on to the Gulf and impacting Louisiana. And Michael, 3 or 4 days notice on a Cat 5 hitting the panhandle of Florida. 4 Cat 5s, all tropical storms 3 days prior.
Wow. Thank you for repeating that, because that is an incredible point. And I think it's something people need to keep in mind, especially as we work to recover from Michael. We talked about, getting not just the surface temps, but getting into the depths of the ocean and combining that with atmosphere. Let's talk about technology. As you look at tech, and whether it's the research you're doing or the kind of tech that can help individuals prepare, are there any kind of things going on the tech side that are exciting to you, or that you might want to see the tech industry tackle to support your work?
I think a few things that come to mind, Leslie, with that question. I love the question because I love the technology, and look at the technology that we're even doing this podcast today. It's incredible that we can do this and reach out to people before the hurricane season. It's, for me, one of the things that I really would like to see happen more often is get more research into operations. We really look at situations. You have the operational meteorologist and you have the research meteorologist helping out with, doing what we talked about, looking at intensity. What's the latest research? Can we take some of that research and put it into operations to help our forecast? We're working on a few plans to bring the researchers in during a hurricane to work right next to our operational meteorologists. Think of that. The research to operations working next to each other. It's one thing to put a team together or a research project, but to actually live in a world that each can see each other's world, that could really bring that together. So I'm very excited about that. And listen to the technology here. I did want to talk about this. And, as you asked the question, I jotted down a few things. We have more tools at our disposal than ever before. I did want to give, it's kind of a shout out, but it fits this tech question very well. The hurricane hunters. I mean, just the technology that we have with the hurricane hunters. We're all trying to flee the storm, but the hurricane hunters are headed for the storm, going through the storm to get us the data that we need. And the NOAA hurricane hunters the Aircraft Operations Center, we have a Doppler radar on board. I mean, the best radar is the closest one, Leslie. And for us to send a radar into the storm is giving us data that helps us with the watches and warnings and the forecast. And that data gets into the models to help us really understand where the storm is headed. So think about it. We have Doppler radar on an aircraft that we send to a hurricane to fly right through it. That's incredible technology and really helps us out.
That's amazing. And we're going to come back and talk a little bit about the hurricane hunters in a future part of this discussion. All right, so let's move on to public policy. What are some of the things beyond the sphere of the National Hurricane Center with respect to science and research? When we think about public policy, what do you think some of the best practices are out there that really help our nation become hurricane resilient?
I think some of it is, it's the work that you're doing at Flash, Leslie. I mean, I want to kick it off with that because it's looking at the resiliency. It's bouncing back. I can't stop the storm. We can't stop the storm. So we have to deal with them. We have to plan for them. We have to be prepared. We have to be resilient. So the building codes that you're working on, I think, is a huge step in making sure we can bounce back from these storms. I mean, doing this podcast, thinking about where we are, understanding that risk and knowing about our windows, knowing about our rooftops. Are there trees that are too close to your home? It's really identifying and being resilient to those type of things. The other one too, for me, is the better we can do with the science, the better we can target evacuation zones, policy associated with who's at risk, who's on the coast and in danger from that storm surge. You can't help but think how far we've come to really be able to narrow down who evacuates in a hurricane is huge because evacuations are costly. And not only that, they're dangerous. So, there's a vulnerable population that is at risk just by evacuating. So if we can narrow that down and work on policies associated with that, that's a big deal that as we go forward. And I think allowing these policies to help us out with the science and the modeling, that saves lives. I mentioned it before, Leslie, the better we can do with the actual science of that forecast and have support to be able to do that, the better we can identify those impacts and the risk, and that really can save lives. So those are some of the things that really come to mind. Being resilient, the building codes, being ready for this. The bottom line, we can't stop these storms. We just got to be ready and be ready to bounce back.
I love it. Well, as you know, several years ago, we collaborated in an effort to bring more transparency to the digital access to evacuation zones and maps and routes from the coast. And so one of the things we're really excited about is we're publishing our 2020 evacuation zone survey. And each year, more and more communities put up links so that people can look up their evacuation zones ahead of time and know whether or not they're in a storm surge evacuation zone so they can do really good planning while the weather is good. So that's one of our collaborations that we continue, that we're still seeing progress there. But pretty soon, Ken, I think that list will be complete. Everything will be online. And that, I think, is just a sign of the kind of public-private partnerships that really help, drive good public policy. So that's exciting. And I think that's a great point about evacuation, especially this year. And we'll be talking about COVID, of course, in our next section here. So let's switch to practice. The practitioners from first responders to those that are pre-storm, in our space in particular, we're focused on communication. And as risk communicator drives decision-making, whether it's something related to evacuation zone behavior or whether or not people are prepared. And this past year, you spoke at the National Disaster Resilience Conference, our annual event, and you talked a lot about how the National Hurricane Center and NOAA is really focused on this issue of risk communication, public perception, decision-making, and the other human factors that drive this behavior. So what is it that has brought traditional meteorological and atmospheric science entity into risk communication and the social science side?
I'll tell you how important it is to me, and it strikes such a passionate chord with me, just doing this. I was kind of reflecting yesterday, thinking about 25 years in the National Weather Service, 27 years in this business. And I've seen the physical science, Leslie, come so far. We started off with that, how well the forecast has become. But the reality is, even a perfect forecast doesn't do much good if it's not understood and actionable. And so that's where the social science comes in. It's We have to find ways to be able to communicate this information. And the people that are receiving it, I mean, there's some that are right, they're first out. I mean, as soon as they see any storm, they're ready to go. But we have another segment of the population that's not going to leave. And there's a lot of people in between. There's barriers to leaving, financial barriers. There's where do I go? The lack of planning. There's different ways, methods of receiving information. I can tell you that my kids receive information differently than I do, and I receive information differently than my mom and my grandmother did, because I always ask. So there's those type of things, and how we spend so much time with the social media. So we have to involve social science in all of this. And think about it. Perception of that risk is really driving decisions. And it's one thing to think about the physical science, but the social really drives those decisions, because people's risk perception is based on their previous experience. And that makes a difference. How do we convey uncertainty? We constantly talk about this at the office, ranges, and little wiggles matter. Have you heard me say that before, Leslie? Little wiggles matter.
Yes.
It's cutesy, but it's so serious, because everybody listening today has to realize that a 20 or 40 mile wiggle is not a bad forecast. It's just the nature of this business. But that can mean a difference to somebody on the ground, a specific location. That 20 to 40 mile wiggle can make the difference between a foot of storm surge and maybe 10 foot of storm surge, or 2 inches of rain versus 50, or tornadoes and no tornadoes, or damaging wind, not damaging wind. So those are the uncertainties. So that, you think about it, that's social science on how we communicate that.
It is. And heard you speak before. You told us some stories from Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Michael of people that you interviewed after the fact. And you just mentioned that people rely on their past experience to make decisions about evacuation. Can you share some of the stories that you've heard from people after the fact of why they did or did not evacuate?
One of them is a social science term called anchoring. Anchoring is a very interesting thing. We heard from some people that looked at the forecast and looked at the information maybe 3 or 4 days prior and made their decisions based on that and never looked again. And the forecast does change. That's one thing that I thought was pretty interesting. The other was, well, we expect this to be a big impact on the coast. Well, I don't live on the coast. I live, 50 miles inland, 100 miles inland. Well, in the case of Florence, storm surge was pushed up the rivers, in some cases, Leslie, 100 miles. So if you're 100 miles inland on one of these rivers, traditionally you may not think of storm surge, but you have to. And on top of that was the immense amount of rain. So we have to start thinking about, talk about evacuations right on the coast, but what about the risk inland? It's not just from the storm surge right on the coast, but storm surge inland. It's the heavy rain. That sort of thing, I think, is something we need to have conversations about. And here's another one. I have to get this in before I forget, is, you look at Florence, you look at the Michael situation, you look at, 2017, 2018, most of the fatalities were water. And in fact, about 83% of the fatalities in those years from tropical systems was water, and half of those were in automobiles. So it's another thing that we have to talk about is the risk, and most of those fatalities in automobiles. We got to talk about how we can prevent those. And the other one in Michael was, there was, again, we have a segment of the population that goes pretty quick. We have the others that are last minute. You talk about risk perception is based on previous experience. It's been a long time since that area got a significant hurricane. So there was a lot of people thinking, well, they normally turn, but that's not the case. Everybody has to always realize every season is different. Every storm is different. Just because you haven't got hit before doesn't mean you can't get hit. Once again, we circle back to the whole social science issue here. So we're working on it. We have some big social science projects. We're going to look at our website. We're looking at the cone. We're looking at all aspects of how we communicate, couple that information between the physical science and social science. More to come on that. We'll have a whole podcast, hopefully in the future, that talks about how maybe we can change the communication.
That's fantastic. Okay, so speaking of communication and outreach, as we know, we're in the ramp up to June 1st in the beginning of the season. And ordinarily, Ken, we'd be on the road together right now on the Hurricane Awareness Tour. Can you tell our listeners about the Hurricane Awareness Tour, also known as the HAT, and what is it that we do together out there? And while we're not doing it this year, what's so important about the work we do and how we bring this information to the public?
Well, first of all, since we're not on the hat together, Leslie, I get to publicly say I miss you. And the reason I say that is because it really talks about the partnerships between, Flash and the Weather Service, NOAA, the private sector, the public sector, the media, emergency management. We all come together on the hat. I think it's amazing. You see everyone come together about preparedness. Hurricane Preparedness Week, it's determining your risk. Remember, each day we have another theme: determine your risk, the evacuation plan, the disaster supplies, insurance checkups, strengthening your home, the written plan. But I want to talk about helping your neighbor too. This is an incredible opportunity for everyone to get together and talk about all this. We have a vulnerable population as well. It's places that we can have a news conference, places that we can talk about stats like this, because it's not over till it's over. This is an opportunity like the hat to talk about, well, the storm's passed me, but I'm still not out of danger. Do you know? I want to talk about this stat because it's brand new, and I there's certain things I just don't want to forget on this podcast. If you're over 60 years old, do you know you're 8 times more likely to be a victim in a tropical system than if you're under 21? That's a serious stat. So the hat is a place to talk about these stats, to meet people and talk about these vulnerabilities. And I have to say, the most favorite part about the hat is definitely, working with you and Flash and everybody, but it has to be the hurricane hunters. The planes are there, seeing the looks on the kids' faces as they meet the meteorologists, as they meet the hurricane hunters, as they meet everybody that's behind the scenes doing this work. That's my favorite part, watching the kids. We're going to get them early, and they're going to be growing up thinking resilience, and they'll be more resilient when they grow up.
And I wonder how many 7-year-olds are coming through the aircraft thinking, you know what, this is what I want to be when I grow up. I think that
yes.
I don't know if I'll be here by the time those folks are out there working as meteorologists, but I know that it's inspiring for all of them. So as we talked about the hat this year and the overarching campaign of helping people become hurricane strong, obviously we couldn't do it in person and visit cities on the aircraft. So at Flash, what we did, I think, is we did a survey to see what's on folks' minds in addition to COVID-19, and how could we bring together their attention to make sure that getting ready for hurricane season is not left behind, because we don't want to have the compounding problems. And I think, we learned a couple things pretty obvious. People are thinking about COVID-19. What we wanted to try to understand is, how is it going to affect their level of preparedness? So one upside to the survey is that more people plan to prepare this year and prepare now. And inside that answer, that 7% more in 10 of the most hurricane affected states historically said they were going to prepare now. They said it's because they're worried about getting supplies in time and the ease of getting supplies and continuing to social distance. So as terrible and tragic as this pandemic is, there is an upside impact on the intent to prepare by the public. And what we've done in response to that is try to focus on those. Hurricane Strong this year has an added tag, and it's Hurricane Strong at home. So we've got, as you know, a lot of new information out there, all the key messages you just mentioned, do it yourself, affordable, self-powered things you can do at home, things you can order online, like caulking. I mean, there are a lot of cool things you can do to strengthen your home with caulk, from your roof to your soffits to your windows, and it's inexpensive, as you know. So we're trying to focus on, based on very small research we did through this survey, we're trying to focus on helping people actualize their plans and get ready, and empowering them to do it. And then on top of everything else, Lowe's has donated a sweepstakes. So every week from now till June 100 people are going to win a $50 gift card so they can order caulk, right? And we're going to get everybody ready this year. And that way, hopefully, they can cross this off their worry list. And so we're looking forward to continuing to talk to people about that messaging. And we hope that the season is not, I know that it only takes one, and you always say that, but I really can't wrap this up without asking you a couple questions about the outlook for 2020. We talked about Dorian, and I think you talked about what you learned in 2019 as well as 17 and 18. But what do you think is ahead for 2020? as you know, based on what we're hearing, and it's always a tricky business, but I really think that people want to hear what you think.
Yeah, I'm always really honest with what that outlook means and how people should prepare. So I think it's worth talking about it. But first, before I get to that, congratulations on the survey and working out, being prepared at home. Those are just outstanding efforts to make sure we're ready for the hurricane season. I just get excited hearing all that, Leslie. So thank you for doing that. And it is about that. And one thing I would add, though, and it's something that we've done personally in my own family, is, I've had some days at work. I've had some days at home. I've never teleworked in my career, but I've spent some days teleworking like today. But you know what it did? It gave us a chance to talk as a family. We sat around one evening. I have 3 teenagers here. They made fun of me a little bit, but I got them back. It was okay. I got us to talk about our own plan. So while we're at home and you got the family home as well, talk about it. It's a great time to put down your plan, write down your plan, be ready. But the outlook, look, every indication is, so far that's come out, a lot of different universities and private sector companies put out an outlook, and every one of them have been consistent about being above average. And NOAA's outlook comes out May 21st, so stand by for that in May. But busy or not, you look back at history, we have to prepare as if we're going to be hit. The outlooks are generally speaking about how many storms and don't predict landfall. So I think it's really good to understand what that means. So above average, we're going to have a lot of storms to deal with. It doesn't predict where we're going to have landfall or how many landfalls, but be prepared. I always say this. It's just, again, it goes back to doing this for so many years, Leslie. You have to prepare every single year as if you will have some sort of impact from a tropical system, whether it be a slow-moving tropical storm that, you're not dealing with the wind, but all of a sudden you're dealing with 20, 30, 40 inches of rain because it's slow-moving, or a powerful hurricane. That you have to understand to be prepared for all those. Write the plan. Like you said, get the house ready, get everything ready, write the plan, know where you're going to go. And a big one here as well, know your risk. Have ways to get information during the storm. Behind the scenes, Leslie, you and I talk during a hurricane. We're constantly working with the media, emergency management, and the private sector. We're all in it together during these things. So have a plan, think about it being hit, and prepare for that every single year.
Ken, that is the best counsel. I think, my last question was going to be, what is the most important message you want to leave us with today? And I think that you've just given us a real call to arms. If everyone prepared every year as if they are going to be affected, then I think we could really transcend and eliminate a lot of the problems that happen. I think it's human nature to want to try to calibrate and gauge and look at the forecast and judge. But I think that if we could all agree to rally around your message, it would get us to that bounce back and that disaster resilience we're looking for. I want to thank you for serving as our most amazing first interview for our podcast, Strong Homes and Safe Families. I want to thank you for your service and everything that you and everyone at the National Hurricane Center and the hurricane hunters and all of the National Weather Service, how you serve our country. I don't know where we would be without you. We will never find out. You guys are really taking care of us in hurricanes and in blue skies alike. So thank you so much for being with us. And we will look forward to being with you on the Hurricane Awareness Tour in 2021.
Sounds great. Thank you for what you do, Leslie. We definitely can't do it without the partnership. We're all in this together. That really is a good way to end it, right? Together, we can be ready and prepared for the next storm.
Absolutely. Thank you again to our guest, Ken Graham, Director of the National Hurricane Center. And thank you for listening to this week's episode of Strong Homes, Safe Families. Please visit us at hurricanestrong.org and access our free resources in English and Spanish, where you can give us a call toll-free at 877-221-SAFE. That's 877-221-7233. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, share, and please give us a review on iTunes. Until next time.